months that I lived there was that they are some of the strongest, most spirited people that I have ever met. And it was an absolute pleasure to be able to share your country. I was only there for 6 months, but it will always be in my heart. So I want to thank you for that opportunity. I also found that while I was working with all the political parties there, of all the Majorité Présidentielle, so the ruling party and also the opposition parties, bringing them together, I sincerely believe that if the Congolese people have the opportunity to sit together and to work things out in their own country for themselves, they will do it. They have the capacity to do it. I saw it with my own eyes. For 6 months, I brought people together from different parties. My job there was to be the director of a democracy promotion NGO. I'd like to make note that I was not there through the Canadian government. I actually had to go through the American government because Canada wasn't sending anybody over there. And so I was heading a project with the objective to encourage dialogue between political parties. And with the 15 parties, in the beginning, a lot of them were sitting back and saying, you know, who is this Canadian here telling us we need to talk to each other? But by the end, I really saw that through discourse, through discussion, through dialogue, there was a tremendous goodwill that was built. And even though the elections did not go well, and one of the things you heard me say before was that even the 6 months that I was there, I saw the process from the period where the electors list was the registration of the electors happened, where there were tremendous problems, the period where they were changing the electoral law, the constituency boundaries, which there were huge problems, the lack of publishing the electors list, the lack of audit of the electors list. There were issues with the maps, with where the actual voting stations were going to be. In fact, at one point, I sent people out to look for some of these polling stations when they didn't exist. And then, of course, the day of the vote, the things that I saw myself, where we saw vote stuffing, we saw ballots outside of the polling stations that were already filled in, and then the compilation center. And I'm not sure if the photos are up. Yeah. So there's some of the photos that we have here of some of the things that I saw myself. And it's because of this that I feel that it's my obligation, because I was witness to what happened, to say publicly that this election was not credible, it was not transparent. The objectives that we had in trying to bring people together, in this particular instance, I believe that we failed. I think that the democratic process in DRC has a tremendous support of the public. What I saw was that the Congolese people wanted democracy. They wanted to vote. Every single Congolese citizen became an observer that day. And whenever there was fraud that was being attempted, you saw the Congolese people themselves taking those ballots, tearing them up, throwing them into the air. And in some cases, maybe a little bit too extreme, but the fact is that people wanted to vote. And in the work that I do, which is democracy promotion, often people say, well, you're going there to impose Western democracy. And the fact is that, yes, in many cases around the world, the word democracy has been used to justify things that were very undemocratic. But the fact is that democracy means people can choose who governs them and participate in their governance, and that the government is accountable back to those people. And this is something that, no matter who I spoke to, also people on the majority as well as the opposition, they wanted that. And I think that to turn the other cheek, or to turn away a blind eye to the kind of fraud that happened, to at the very least, disorganization that happened, is to do a disservice, because the institutions that are there didn't work. The Supreme Court was supposed to be the court that would say whether or not the elections were fraudulent or whether or not they were legitimate. And that didn't work. The institutions failed. And pretty much everybody, the Carter Center, the European Union, the Catholic Church, many of the embassies have said that the institutions didn't work. The Electoral Commission did not do the job that it was supposed to do. But then there's fraud. And it's business as usual. And I think that to say that at the least we don't know who won this election, and if we don't really know, because ballots have disappeared, I mean, up to $1.3 million have disappeared. If it's impossible impossible to know. Imagine here in Canada, if we said that, well, Stephen Harper won the election, but we don't really know for sure. It wouldn't be good enough. And what I heard over and over again when I was in DRC was among the diplomatic community was, well, as long as the elections got passed, as long as it's good enough. And it wasn't good enough. It's not good enough when we don't know who really won the election. And many people in this room probably have your own views on who actually won the election. Anecdotally, I probably share those views. But the fact is that it's enough to be able to say that we don't know. In which case, the election has to be done over again. To me, you cannot say on the one hand that the election was not legitimate, that the government is not legitimate, and then not do anything about it. Canada has an opportunity. We are still seen, despite the best efforts of this government to destroy our reputation, we are still seen as a very credible moral authority in the world. Canada has a very strong reputation. And if Canada came out tomorrow and said, we will not recognize this election, it is not a legitimate election, and Canada will not recognize. I think that you will see a lot of other governments follow. There is a lot of hand-wringing going on in Washington right now. I was in Washington in December, and there are a lot of people, and I don't know about other countries, but there are a lot of people very uncomfortable with what has happened. And there's a lot of debate going on, because I think that because they were looking the other way, they didn't see it. They didn't see the sense that was building amongst the population, and they didn't see the warning signs, despite the fact that myself and others were trying to warn. There are some pictures here that I want to show you. Of course, this is the ballot, and I actually take the point of the last speaker who said that there were not really 400 parties. This is absolutely true. We actually sent drivers around Kinshasa to the head offices of all the political parties, and they found about 150 that really existed. So the rest were paper parties. So, but even with 150 or 200 or so political parties, we had 18,000 candidates. This is another example of divide and conquer, because if you have 18,000, more than 18,000 candidates for only 500 positions, you know that you can't have a real competitive election. So this is the kind of thing we were doing to try to build the political parties, the ability to organize, to bring people together. And I think that is the single most important message that I came out of Congo with, which is that the importance of people working together instead of falling in the trap of always being divided. It is in the interest of certain people for the Congolese people to be divided, because Congo has a lot of money under the soil. And I think that if the Congolese people come together, from what I saw, they are able to resolve their differences. The conversations that happened in that room were very, very positive. But it didn't happen this time. So, I mean, my view is the election has to happen again. These are the photos. If you can flip to the next one, please. Yeah. Okay, that's the voters list, which of course, as I mentioned earlier, it was supposed to legally have been posted 30 days prior to the election. Most of these went up the weekend before, and the excuse that was given was that, well, the rain might ruin them or something. We all know that a lot of people, and I saw them myself, a lot of people tried still to vote and were told they weren't on the list, even though the chair of the election commission 3 days before the election said that if you had an elector's card, you could vote. But most of the polling station clerks either didn't know that or were manipulative in that. So a lot of people didn't even get to vote, never mind ballots that were lost. And flip to the next. This is just, I put this picture in there because of the spirit of the people to vote. These people were actually holding up their voter's cards and saying, let us vote. Look, we've got our voter's cards. They were almost pushing in the door to want to vote. And so this idea that we were somehow imposing this democracy, that this came from outside Congo, is absolutely untrue. This was what the will of the people of DRC was, at least in the experience that I had. That is the voting compilation center in Kinshasa. I mean, we went there, and actually right after this, it started to rain. And we were literally, the ballots were on the ground, and they were being trampled into the mud. And it was so disorganized. And what happened, we were going around, there's a number of warehouses there. And each of the warehouses, they were counting the ballots, and then they would go around, and then they would compare at the end the results of the ballot count with the results that came in from the polling station to see if they were the same. And we saw all these ballots, these bags open and torn and spread all over the place, things that were unmarked, and all these. And then at the very end, I went to the people at the computers and I said, so how does it compare with the vote count from here and the vote count from the polling station? 99% accurate. It's exactly the same. And I go to the final slide. Just 2 slides. So these are the ballots. That's where they were counting. And then the next one. These are the results of one of the polling stations in Katanga, where the yellow is for Kabila, and that little T sliver that you see, that's everybody else. And I've never seen an election where no one votes for the other candidates. So this is the kind of thing that anybody who's a logical thinking person who was there, who saw what was going on, cannot possibly come out and say that this election was legitimate. And the question is not whether it was legitimate. I think most of the international community accepts, even if they don't say so, that it was not a legitimate election. The question is, what do we do about it? And that is where we're at right now today. And the decision on that question is not going to impact just DRC, it's going to impact all of Africa and most developing democracies, most new democracies, because a lot of young people are going to say, well, we voted and we did this whole process and nothing changed, so next time let's pick up a gun. And that's the thing that I fear the most, because democracy hasn't even had a chance yet. The institutions aren't even there. Elections, somebody else earlier said, one of the speakers, that elections are not democracy, and we couldn't be more right. The democracy requires free media, as we heard earlier. It requires a police force that is paid enough, that they are independent. It requires a Supreme Court that will actually rule independently of the government, an electoral commission that isn't stacked 3 in favor of the government and 2 against. All of these things, an auditor general, a parliament, all of these things are part of democracy. And until DRC has those, it will never be able to have a free and fair election, because all of those things need to be hand in hand. And so the one thing that I think in terms of the future of DRC is that instead of polarizing, instead of saying, okay, well, this was fraudulent and so we're all enemies, is that everybody give a little, and those in power have got to make room for other voices. And opposition needs to participate, needs to be part of the institutions. It's much harder to ignore someone who's there in your face than it is to ignore someone out in the street. So I do believe we need to have a new election, but I'm realistic. I don't know whether that's going to happen. So at the very least, in order to prevent another generation before there's going to be any real good governance and democracy and development, it is going to take a bringing together. And I think that the discourse this evening, for the most part, has been about bringing together. So that would be my
Thank you very much, Mr. Benedale. So